In the spring of 1829, a simple farmer was working the land near the border of Delaware and Maryland. He made a discovery that would uncover one of America's most terrifying criminal operations. His workhorse suddenly fell through the ground into a hole. This revealed a wooden box buried under the dirt. Inside that box were the old, yellow bones of what looked like a man. The man's skull showed clear signs of a violent attack. This was only the start. In the weeks that followed, police would find the bodies of at least 7 more people on that land. This included 3 young children. They were all victims of a woman whose name was already a scary, whispered secret across the Delmarva Peninsula. Martha Patty Cannon. For almost 20 years, Cannon had run what experts today call the reverse Underground Railroad. This was a system that captured free black people and escaped slaves. It then sold them back into slavery in the Deep South. But her crimes were not just about stealing people. Cannon was also a serial killer. She murdered other slave traders who were her rivals. She killed people who saw her crimes. She even killed children when they became a problem for her business. Official court papers from Sussex County, Delaware, show she was formally charged with 4 murders. But people who knew her claimed the real number was more than 20. Before we go on with the story of Patty Cannon and her time of terror along the Mason-Dixon line, I want to hear from you. What state or city are you listening from? Cannon's crime network reached far beyond her home in Delaware. It affected towns from Philadelphia all the way to the Mississippi Delta. Leave a comment and tell me where you're hearing this story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. These dark parts of American history need to be remembered. The finding of those buried bodies would finally expose a criminal plan that had worked without punishment for over 10 years. It was protected by confusion over which police force was responsible, by racism, and by the simple, awful fact that most of its victims were people that white society did not care about when they disappeared. The place where Patty Cannon built her empire of fear was perfect for crime. In the early 1800s, the area now called Reliance was where 3 different police territories met: Sussex County in Delaware, and Caroline and Dorchester counties in Maryland. This smart location let criminals simply walk across county and state lines to run away from the police. The area was so far from everything that people nearby called it Johnson's Crossroads. It was named for the bar that became the main office for the most famous kidnapping group in American history. The land itself seemed made for hiding. Thick woods of pine and oak trees went on for miles. There were swampy areas and small open spaces with lonely farms. The Nanticoke River flowed through the region, giving waterways that could move captured people quietly at night. Roads were just dirt paths. The closest real towns were days away on a horse. For someone who wanted to live outside the law, it was the perfect spot. Martha Cannon, called Patty by people who knew her, came to this border area sometime around 1790. Court papers suggest she was born around 1760, maybe named Lucretia Patricia Hanley, but she kept her past a secret on purpose. Some stories say she was born in Canada and moved to Delaware when she was 16. What we know for sure is that she married Jesse Cannon, a local farmer who owned land near the state line. Together, they had at least 1 daughter and lived what seemed like a normal country life. Jesse Cannon was described by people nearby as a quiet man who stayed alone. He worked his small farm and grew tobacco and corn like many other settlers. The Cannon home was on a small piece of land that sat right on the Delaware-Maryland border. This detail would become very important for Patty's later crimes. The house was a simple 2-story building made in the common style of that time. It had thick wooden walls and small windows. What the neighbors did not know was that this normal-looking home would soon have secret rooms and hiding places made to hide kidnapped people. But under this surface of normal life was something much darker. The early 1800s was a very important time for American slavery. When the U.S. government stopped allowing new slaves from Africa in 1808, the need for workers in the new cotton fields of Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia created a very profitable market within America. A strong adult slave who might have cost $300 before the ban now sold for over $1,000 in the Deep South. This price jump created a very strong reason for criminals to trade in human suffering. The economy of the South had changed after the invention of the cotton gin. It created a huge demand for slave workers. Cotton farming was growing very fast in the Gulf Coast states. Farm owners were ready to pay high prices for workers. The legal ban on bringing slaves from Africa meant that the only way to get new slaves was from within America. This was either through slave families having children, or by capturing and re-enslaving free black people. The Delmarva Peninsula was especially open to these criminals. After the Revolutionary War, many slave owners had freed their slaves. This was either through new laws that slowly ended slavery or through individual acts of freeing someone. Maryland and Delaware had large groups of free black people who worked as farm workers, skilled workers, and small farmers. These communities, while free by law, lived in constant fear. They had no powerful people to protect them, little help from the law, and when they disappeared, it was often not reported or not looked into by white authorities, who did not see them as fully human. The legal situation of free black people in the early 1800s was very shaky. While they were not slaves, they had almost none of the rights that white people had. They could not vote, be on juries, or speak in court against white people in most places. Their freedom could be questioned at any time. They had to carry documents proving they were free. For criminals like Paddy Cannon, these legal weaknesses created chances to take advantage of people. Into this world came Paddy Cannon, a woman who proved that evil has no gender. Stories from the time describe her as a big, strong woman with unusual power for a woman. She was nearly 6 feet tall at a time when most women were only about 5 feet tall, and she had what neighbors called a scary way about her. Her voice was said to be deep and strong, and she was known for angry explosions when someone upset her. Her husband, Jesse, died in a mysterious way around 1826. Some people later said she poisoned him. This left her a widow with total control over the family property. By this time, she had already started making the criminal connections that would make her name mean terror. There were almost no police in the rural border area. The small amount of authority that did exist was often corrupt or simply could not handle the amount of crime. The social situation of the area also helped criminals. The white population was spread out and often moving around. It was mostly small farmers, workers, and people trying to run away from their past in more settled areas. There was little sense of community. Neighbors usually did not get involved in each other's business, no matter what they might have suspected. This loneliness and lack of care would be key to Cannon's ability to work for so many years without being caught. The change of Paddy Cannon from a frontier widow to a criminal leader began with her daughter's marriages. This would set the pattern for the next 20 years. Both of the husbands her young daughters married were slave kidnappers. Her first husband, Henry Brereton, was a blacksmith who made extra money by capturing free black people to sell in the South. In 1811, Brereton was arrested and put in jail in Georgetown, Delaware, for kidnapping. But that same year, he managed to break out of jail. Brereton's criminal life was well known in the local area long before his arrest. As a blacksmith, he had real reasons to travel all over the region, visiting farms and settlements to shoe horses and fix tools. This freedom to move was perfect cover for his illegal work. He would find possible victims during his real business visits. He would note which families had teenage children or young adults who might sell for a high price in southern slave markets. The ways used by early kidnappers like Brereton were often simple but worked. They used tricks, pure force, and the lonely nature of country life to catch their victims. A common method was to approach free black families with offers of jobs in faraway places. Parents who were desperate for money and chances for their children would sometimes let them travel with these fake employers. They discovered too late that they had sent their children to their doom. It was after his jailbreak that the first known murder connected to the Cannon family happened. Brereton, working with Paddy Cannon and another criminal named Joseph Griffith, attacked a slave trader known only as Rigdell at Cannon's bar. The plan was simple but brutal. Get the victim drunk, steal his money and slaves, then kill the witness. Court papers show that Rigdell was shot and killed during the robbery. Brereton and Griffith were eventually caught and hanged on April 13, 1813, but Paddy Cannon was not charged. The Rigdell murder was a big step up in the crime centered on the Cannon property. Before this, the family had been involved mainly in helping with kidnappings and giving a safe place for criminals passing through. The willingness to murder for money showed a level of cruelty that would mark all of Cannon's future actions. Old newspaper stories about the Rigdell case give scary details about the crime. The victim had been traveling through the area with a lot of money, some think between $3,000 and $5,000, to buy slaves in local markets. He had stopped at what he thought was a real bar for food and a place to sleep. Not knowing he had walked into a trap, the plotters gave him alcohol all night, waiting for the right time to attack. When Rigdell finally went to his room, Brereton and Griffith followed him. Neighbors later said they heard yelling and the sound of a fight, followed by a gunshot. By morning, Rigdell was dead. His money was gone, and his wagon and horses had vanished. The body was quickly buried on the property, starting what would become a normal practice of using the lonely location as a hiding place for murder victims. The killing of her daughter's first husband did not stop Cannon from her chosen path. Instead, it seemed to make her methods better and her determination stronger to build a more advanced criminal group. The lesson she learned from Brereton's capture was not that crime does not pay, but that criminals needed better organization and more careful plans to avoid being caught. When her daughter married again, this time to Joseph Johnson, Cannon got a partner who would be even more useful to her criminal business. Johnson was not just another kidnapper. He was a businessman who understood the details of moving people on a large scale. He had connections all through the South, experience in moving things and people, and most importantly, the money needed to grow their work beyond simple crimes of chance. Johnson brought to the team a bar located exactly on the Delaware-Maryland state line. This place, which became known as Joe Johnson's Tavern, was in such a smart spot that different rooms were actually in different states. This geographic advantage let them move kidnapped victims between police areas to confuse chasing police. When Delaware police came with orders to arrest, suspects could just step into the Maryland parts of the building and say they were safe from Delaware police. The bar served many purposes for the growing criminal business. It was a real business that provided cover for their activities, making money and explaining the constant coming and going of travelers and wagons. It worked as a holding place for captives waiting to be moved south. It had specially built hidden rooms and basements made to hide human cargo, and it was a meeting place for the network of criminals who worked for them. It was a neutral place where plans could be made and money shared. The physical setup of the bar showed its many uses. The main floor looked completely normal, with a common room for travelers, a bar area, and rooms for real guests. But under the building was a series of cellars and tunnels that had been specially built for hiding kidnapped people. These underground spaces were reachable through hidden entrances and were made to quiet sound and prevent escape. Iron rings set into stone walls gave anchor points for chains. Small air shafts made sure captives would not suffocate during long times locked up. The gang that came together around Cannon and Johnson was very mixed for its time. It included white criminals like Henry Carr, mixed-race tricksters like John Purnell, who used many fake names, and even enslaved people forced to help capture others. This mixed-race makeup was planned. Black gang members could approach possible victims without right away causing suspicion. White members handled deals with buyers in the Deep South. John Purnell, described in court papers as a yellow man or mulatto, was especially valuable to the group. His mixed race let him move between white and black communities fairly easily. He kept many identities and could show himself as either a free person of color looking for work or a light-skinned white man doing business, depending on the situation. This ability to change like a lizard made him perfect for finding possible victims and making first contact. As the 1820s went on, the size of the Cannon-Johnson operation grew greatly. Their network reached from Pennsylvania to Louisiana, with known connections to buyers in Alabama, Mississippi, and Mayor Joseph Watson of Philadelphia, a Quaker who was deeply committed to protecting free black people, began tracking the disappearances of people from his city and following them back to the Delmarva Peninsula. Watson's research showed the terrifying size of the operation. In 1825 alone, he wrote down dozens of kidnappings connected to the Cannon gang. The victims were not just random targets. They were often picked specially for how easy they were to target. Young adults brought the highest prices in southern markets, but children were also valuable. They could be trained for specific jobs and would provide many years of work. The planned nature of these kidnappings showed a level of organization that went far beyond crimes of chance. The gang kept detailed information about possible targets, following families and people who might be easy to capture. They knew which young people had recently lost their jobs, which families were having money problems, and which people might be tempted by offers of work in faraway places. One of the most detailed stories comes from Lydia Smith, a 25-year-old free woman who was kidnapped in 1825. Her story, saved in court papers, describes being held first in Cannon's house, then moved to Johnson's Tavern, where she was kept in chains for 5 months. Smith remembered the constant fear, the not enough food, and the knowledge that she was planned to be moved south with a big group of other kidnapped people. Only her eventual rescue by Watson's network saved her from a life of slavery. Smith's story gives important details about the conditions suffered by victims of the Cannon gang. She described being grabbed while walking alone on a road near Philadelphia, overcome by several attackers, and moved by wagon to the Delaware-Maryland border. The trip took several days, during which she was kept blindfolded and chained to prevent escape tries. When she arrived at the Cannon property, she was put in a hidden room under the main house, where she found she was not alone. The underground holding areas, according to Smith's story, held dozens of other kidnapped people at different times. Men, women, and children were kept in separate areas, all chained to prevent escape. The conditions were made hard on purpose. not enough food, no toilets, and constant darkness, except when guards brought candles during feeding times. The mental torture was as brutal as the physical conditions, as captives knew they were meant to be sold into lifelong slavery. Smith also gave details about the gang's methods for handling their human cargo. Victims were systematically stripped of any papers proving they were free. Any personal items that might help identify them were destroyed. They were given new names and fake life stories that would support their sale as real slaves. Those who fought back or tried to keep their real identities were beaten until they gave in. The gang's activities were a known secret in the local community. Neighbors knew that people disappeared near the Cannon property, that wagons came at strange hours, and that Johnson's Tavern held suspicious meetings. But the victims were black people in a society where their word had little power against that of white criminals. Local police, when they existed at all, showed little interest in looking into crimes against people they saw as naturally suspicious. The involvement of the local white community in the gang's activities went beyond just not caring. Some neighbors actively helped the criminal business, either by taking part directly or by giving information about possible victims. Local shop owners supplied the gang with supplies, asking no questions about where their payment came from. Even some police were suspected of taking bribes to ignore suspicious activities when they were reported. This lack of care changed only when white victims became involved. The gang did not just kidnap free black people. They also robbed and murdered slave traders who came through their area carrying large amounts of cash. These victims were white men working in the legal slave trade, and their disappearances got the attention that black victims never received. The first known case happened around 1820, when a slave trader from Georgia named Bell or Miller disappeared while traveling through the area. This man had been carrying a large amount of money, some stories say $35,000, to buy slaves. He was last seen at Cannon's place, and his horse was later found in her possession. When asked, Cannon said the man had sailed south with a group of slaves, but investigators found this story hard to believe. The Georgia trader's disappearance was the start of a pattern that would finally lead to the gang's downfall. Unlike black victims, whose disappearances created little official interest, missing white slave traders had business partners and money backers who demanded investigations. These men carried large amounts of money and had planned travel routes that made their disappearances hard to explain away. Cannon's method for dealing with these victims was typically brutal. The traders would be invited to the bar pretending to do real business. Once there, they would be given alcohol and encouraged to talk about their money and travel plans. When the chance came, they would be murdered and robbed. Their bodies were buried on the property, and their money and any slaves they were traveling with were taken into the gang's operations. The profits from these murders were huge. A single slave trader might carry enough money to fund the gang's work for months. The slaves they were moving could be sold through the gang's southern networks, making more money. Most importantly, getting rid of these competitors helped the gang keep their control over criminal activities in the area. By the middle of the 1820s, pressure was building on the Cannon-Johnson gang from many directions. Mayor Watson of Philadelphia had started offering large rewards for information leading to arrests. Governor John Andrew Schultz of Pennsylvania was working with officials in southern states to track kidnapped people. Their research was showing not just single crimes, but a planned network that had been working for over a decade. The reward offered by Watson, $500 for information leading to arrests, was a large amount of money for that time, equal to several months' pay for most working people. This money incentive began to make people talk in communities that had before stayed silent about the gang's activities. Former associates, unhappy gang members, and even some victims who had managed to escape began giving information to authorities. The gang's response to this pressure was typically violent. Instead of reducing their activities, they began killing possible witnesses more aggressively. This choice would finally be their downfall, as it made their list of victims include people whose disappearances could not be ignored. The increase in violence during this time showed Patty Cannon's increasingly paranoid thinking. She had built a criminal empire that made huge profits. Some guesses say the gang's yearly income was over $50,000, a fortune by early 19th century standards. But this success had made her a target for police attention, and she became sure that former associates were a deadly threat to her operations. The most important figure in the gang's final exposure was a mixed-race boy named Cyrus James. Cannon had bought James as a slave when he was only 7 years old and had raised him in her household. As he got older, James was forced to take part in the gang's activities, working as a trick to lure other black people into traps. His close knowledge of the gang's operations, combined with his growing disgust at the violence he saw, made him both a very valuable tool and a possible risk. James' place in the Cannon household was unique and sadly complex. As an enslaved child, he had no choice but to take part in whatever activities his owner demanded. But as he grew up, he began to understand the full horror of what he was being forced to do. He was helping to ruin the lives of people who looked like him, people who shared his background and his weakness. This knowledge created an inner conflict that would finally lead him to work with authorities, despite the personal risks. The mental control used by Cannon to control James was advanced and cruel. She switched between treating him as a favorite member of the household and threatening him with violence or sale to brutal owners in the Deep South. She convinced him that his survival depended completely on her protection and that any betrayal would mean his immediate death. This mix of dependence and fear kept James loyal for years, even as he saw more and more horrible crimes. James later said that he saw Cannon murder several children on her property. In one especially horrible story, he described seeing Cannon take a wounded black child, who was not yet dead, from the house in her apron. The child never returned. James knew where the bodies were buried because he had been forced to help get rid of them. The murders James saw were not random acts of violence. They were calculated decisions based on Cannon's guess of risk and profit. Children who got sick or hurt were killed instead of treated, as medical care would have been expensive and would have attracted unwanted attention. Young people who were hard to control or who kept insisting they were free were killed as possible sources of trouble. Even babies born to kidnapped women were sometimes killed if Cannon decided they would be more trouble than they were worth. The gang's end began with their treatment of rival slave traders. Competition in the illegal human trading business was fierce, and Cannon's gang had a reputation for murdering competitors to steal their money and their human cargo. This practice sped up as real police pressure increased. Dead slave traders could not talk about their experiences with the gang. The decision to increase their violence against white victims showed both Cannon's growing desperation and her basic mistake about the results of such actions. She had worked for so long without punishment that she believed she could not be touched. The murder of black people had created no serious police response, so she assumed the same would be true for white victims. This assumption would prove deadly for her criminal business. In early 1829, the bodies began to be found. A farmer renting land owned by Cannon was plowing a low area that had recently been cleared of brush. His horse tripped into what turned out to be a grave. Inside a wooden box, he found human bones that authorities decided belonged to the missing Georgia slave trader from almost 10 years before. This discovery started a careful search of the property that would find multiple burial sites. The farmer who made the first discovery was working land that Cannon had rented out for extra money. The area had before been unused because it often flooded, but recent dry weather had made it good for farming. When the farmer's plow horse suddenly sank into the ground, he first thought he had found a natural hole, or maybe an old well. It was only when he started digging to free his horse that he realized he had found something much more evil. The wooden box holding the bones was very well preserved, suggesting it had been buried fairly recently, even though it held decade-old remains. The box itself seemed to have been specially built to hide a body, with sizes that exactly fit a human form. This level of preparation showed that the burial was not a quick try to hide a crime, but part of a planned approach to getting rid of bodies that had been improved over years of practice. The discovery of the first body in early 1829 started a series of events that would finally end Paddy Cannon's criminal empire. Delaware authorities, working with their partners in Maryland, got search permits and began a full investigation of all properties connected to the Cannon-Johnson gang. What they found was worse than their worst fears. The investigation was led by Sheriff Joseph Houston of Sussex County, Delaware, working with Maryland authorities and people from the Pennsylvania governor's office. This multi-area approach was new for that time and showed the growing understanding that the Cannon gang's activities crossed state lines and needed coordinated police response. The search permits obtained by authorities were very broad, letting them dig up any areas of the Cannon properties where bodies might be hidden. This legal power was crucial, as it protected investigators who might otherwise have been accused of trespassing or illegal search. The permits also said that any evidence found could be used in court cases across multiple areas, helping to close the legal gaps the gang had used for years. On April 3, 1829, Cyrus James was captured in Delaware. The details of his arrest are still somewhat unclear, but court papers suggest he was trying to run away from the area when he was caught. Faced with overpowering evidence and the possibility of execution, the young man, who had been forced into a life of crime as a child, made a life-changing decision. He would work with authorities and tell everything he knew about Paddy Cannon's operations. The decision to work with them was not made easily by James. He understood that his talking would likely result in his own prosecution for the crimes he had been forced to commit. But he also knew that continued silence would mean protecting the woman who had enslaved him and forced him to take part in the destruction of countless other lives. His cooperation was not just a legal strategy, but a moral choice to finally break free from the mental control Cannon had kept over him for years. James' testimony was devastating. Speaking to a justice of the peace in Seaford, Delaware, he gave detailed stories of murders spanning almost a decade. He told investigators that Joseph Johnson, his brother Ebenezer Johnson, and Paddy Cannon had shot the Georgia slave trader while he was eating dinner at Cannon's house. He had watched them carry the body to a wooden box and bury it on the property. But this was only the start of his revelations. The level of detail in James' testimony was amazing and gave investigators their first full understanding of the gang's operations. He could describe not just single crimes, but the planned methods used by the gang over many years. He knew the locations of burial sites, the identities of other gang members, the routes used to move kidnapped people, and the networks of buyers and sellers that reached across multiple states. Following James' directions, authorities began digging up the Cannon property in a planned way. In a garden area, they found the body of a young mixed-race child. According to James' testimony, this child had been enslaved by Cannon along with his mother. Cannon had killed the child because she suspected the father was white, possibly a member of her own family. The article saving this testimony has no information about what happened to the child's mother, leaving open the terrifying possibility that she was also murdered. The discovery of the child's body was especially upsetting to investigators because it showed how cold Cannon was. This was not a victim of kidnapping or a rival criminal. This was a child who had been born into Cannon's household and lived under her control. The murder seemed to have been motivated purely by Cannon's racist paranoia and her fear that a mixed-race child might somehow threaten her operations. More digging found 2 wooden boxes, each holding human bones. James identified one set of remains as belonging to another child he had seen Cannon beat to death with a piece of wood. The third set belonged to an adult whom James described as someone they considered had property, meaning the gang believed this person was free and might have things worth stealing. The planned nature of these murders painted a picture of Cannon as something beyond a simple criminal. She was a serial killer who had been working without punishment for years, protected by the loneliness of her location, the lack of care from local authorities about crimes against black people, and a network of partners who shared in her profits. The physical evidence found during the digging supported James' testimony in amazing detail. The wooden boxes used to hold bodies were of similar build, suggesting they had been specially made for hiding murder victims. The locations of the graves followed a pattern that showed planned thinking, not random burial. Most disturbing, the condition of the remains suggested that some victims had been buried while still alive. As news of the discovery spread, other witnesses began coming forward. People who had lived in fear of Cannon for years suddenly found the courage to speak. Their stories revealed more victims and gave details about the gang's methods that supported James' account. Among these new witnesses was Thomas Freeman, a free black man who had been approached by gang members in 1827, but had managed to escape. Freeman said he had been offered work in Georgia and had been traveling toward the Cannon property when he became suspicious of his escort's behavior. He managed to slip away during a rest stop and spent several days hiding in the woods before getting back to Philadelphia. Freeman's testimony was important because it gave insight into the gang's recruitment methods. He described how the first approach had seemed completely real. He had been struggling to find work in Philadelphia when a well-dressed man approached him with an offer of a job on a Georgia farm. The pay offered was good, and transportation was to be provided free. It was only during the trip that Freeman began to notice problems in his escort stories and became suspicious of their real plans. The size of the investigation grew beyond Delaware. Authorities in Maryland began looking at properties owned by gang members, while officials in Pennsylvania worked to document the full size of the kidnapping network. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Sussex County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in the final chapter of Paddy Cannon's reign of terror. The working together between different areas was a new approach to police work that would later become standard practice. For the first time, authorities were treating the Cannon gang as what it truly was: a criminal plan that worked across state lines and needed a national-level response. This recognition led to the involvement of officials from Washington, D.C., and marked the start of what would eventually become coordinated national police efforts against organized crime. On April 13, 1829, a grand jury of 24 white men in Delaware handed down formal charges against Martha "Paddy" Cannon on 4 counts of murder. The charges were signed by James Rogers, the top lawyer of Delaware, and represented the first time any member of the famous gang had faced serious legal results for their crimes against black people. The makeup of the grand jury itself was important for the time. All 24 members were white men, as required by Delaware law, but they represented different parts of the state's population, including farmers, shop owners, and professionals. The fact that this jury was willing to charge a white woman with the murder of black people marked a notable change in legal attitudes, driven largely by the overpowering evidence presented and the multi-state nature of the crimes. The charges were amazingly specific for the time. Cannon was charged with the murder of a baby girl on April 26, 1822, a young boy on the same date, an adult man on October 1, 1820, and a black boy on June 1, 1824. Each charge carried the death penalty, and the evidence against her was overpowering. The specificity of these charges showed the thorough investigation done by authorities. Unlike many criminal cases of the time, which relied mainly on witness stories and indirect evidence, the Cannon case was built on physical evidence, multiple supporting witnesses, and detailed confessions from a participant who had close knowledge of the crimes. This mix of evidence types made the case almost impossible to defend against. Cyrus James' testimony formed the main part of the prosecution's case. His detailed knowledge of the gang's operations, combined with his ability to lead authorities to burial sites, made him the most valuable witness in Delaware legal history up to that point. The young man who had been forced into crime as a child now held the power to bring justice to the woman who had terrified the area for decades. The prosecution team was led by top lawyer James Rogers, who had made his name prosecuting complex criminal cases across Delaware. Rogers understood that the Cannon case was a chance to show that the law applied equally to all citizens, no matter their race or social status. He also knew that a successful prosecution would send a strong message to other criminal businesses working in the area. But Patty Cannon herself was a figure that was hard to categorize, even for people of her time. Newspaper stories described her as a large, physically powerful woman who commanded fear and respect, even from hardened criminals. At about 70 years old, she remained sharp-minded and defiant, showing no regret for her actions, even when faced with undeniable evidence. Stories from the time about Cannon during her jail time paint a picture of an unrepentant criminal who seemed genuinely confused by the legal actions against her. She apparently saw her actions as legitimate business activities and expressed confusion that authorities were prosecuting her for crimes against people she considered to be property, not human beings. The conditions of her imprisonment in the Sussex County Jail in Georgetown, Delaware, showed both the seriousness of her crimes and the unusual situation of having a female defendant facing multiple murder charges. She was kept under constant guard, as authorities feared both escape tries and possible revenge from surviving gang members. The Georgetown jail itself was a crude stone building that had been built in the early 1800s to hold small-time criminals and people who owed money. It was not designed to hold dangerous felons facing death penalty charges, and authorities had to use special security measures to make sure Cannon stayed in jail. Extra guards were posted, and her cell was made stronger with more iron bars and locks. During her time in jail, Cannon began to speak more freely about her criminal career. According to stories from the time, she admitted to killing at least 24 people over her criminal career. These victims included not just the black people found buried on her property, but also rival slave traders, possible witnesses, and anyone else who posed a threat to her operations. The most chilling part of Cannon's confessions was their matter-of-fact tone. She spoke of murder as a business need, describing the killing of children and adults with the same casual lack of interest she might have used to talk about farm animals. Her apparent lack of any moral sense shocked even hardened police officials who had seen the worst of frontier violence. Cannon's confessions gave authorities details about crimes that went far beyond the charges for which she had been formally accused. She described murders dating back to the early 1810s, kidnappings that had involved hundreds of victims, and a criminal network that had reached into multiple states. These revelations confirmed investigators' suspicions that the crimes found on her property were only a part of the gang's total activities. The legal actions moved forward with unusual speed for the time. The overpowering evidence, combined with public pressure for justice, created momentum for a quick trial and resolution. Court papers suggest that Cannon was expected to face trial within weeks of her formal charges, with execution to follow soon after if she were found guilty. The prosecution's plan was simple: present the physical evidence, provide testimony from Cyrus James and other witnesses, and let the jury reach the obvious conclusion that Cannon was guilty of multiple murders. The defense, what little there was, could only argue for mercy based on Cannon's age and gender, though few observers believed such arguments would work given the horrible nature of the crimes. The trial was scheduled to begin in late May 1829, with jury selection planned for the week before. Legal observers from across the region were expected to attend, as the case represented one of the most significant criminal prosecutions in Delaware history. Newspapers as far away as Philadelphia and Baltimore were planning extensive coverage of the proceedings. The legal actions against Patty Cannon would never reach their planned end. On May 11, 1829, about 3 weeks before her scheduled execution, jail guards found her dead in her cell. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by poison, though the exact details remain unclear. Some stories suggest she had been smuggled arsenic by people who supported her, while others suggest she had been saving up medication for weeks. The discovery of Cannon's body sent shock waves through the Georgetown jail and the wider community. Guards making their regular morning rounds found her lying on the floor of her cell, apparently having died sometime during the night. There were no signs of a struggle or violence, and the cell remained securely locked from the outside. The only evidence of what had happened was a small bottle found hidden in her clothing, which later tests suggested had contained arsenic. The question of how Cannon got the poison remained a mystery that investigators never fully solved. The jail's security procedures were relatively loose by modern standards, and visitors were not searched thoroughly before meeting with prisoners. It was possible that a supporter had smuggled the poison to her during one of these visits, though no specific person was ever identified as the source. Some people at the time guessed that Cannon had been planning her suicide from the moment of her arrest. She had seen the execution of her daughter's first husband and understood exactly what fate waited for her if she were found guilty. Rather than face the public shame of execution, she chose to die on her own terms, keeping control over her fate until the very end. Her death stole from the victims' families the satisfaction of seeing justice served, but it also brought to a close one of the most planned criminal businesses in early American history. Court papers show that Cannon's death effectively ended the reverse Underground Railroad that had worked along the Delmarva Peninsula for almost 20 years. The immediate aftermath of Cannon's death was chaotic. Authorities had been preparing for what they expected to be the most significant criminal trial in Delaware history, and her suicide left them with unanswered questions about the full size of her criminal network. The investigation into her activities continued for several months, but without her testimony, many details about the gang's operations remained unclear. The fate of her surviving partners varied. Joseph Johnson, her son-in-law and main partner, had fled to Alabama or Mississippi before the investigations began. His brother Ebenezer also escaped to the Deep South, where they presumably continued their criminal activities beyond the reach of Delaware authorities. Local police made half-hearted attempts to chase them, but the area complications and huge distances involved made successful prosecution unlikely. Only Cyrus James, the enslaved boy forced into crime, remained to face justice. His cooperation with authorities finally led to his freedom, not execution. The Delaware courts, recognizing that James had been forced into taking part in the gang's activities and that his testimony had been crucial to uncovering the crimes, gave him his freedom and provided him with protection from revenge. James' fate after the trial was one of the few good outcomes from the entire tragic event. He was moved to Pennsylvania, where abolitionists helped him create a new identity and start a real life. Some stories suggest he later became active in the real Underground Railroad, using his knowledge of criminal networks to help real efforts to assist escaped slaves. The investigation revealed that the Cannon-Johnson gang had been responsible for the kidnapping of hundreds of free black people over the course of their operations. While exact numbers are still argued, careful guesses suggest they trafficked between 500 and 1,000 people into slavery in the Deep South. The economic value of these crimes, measured in the prices slaves commanded in Southern markets, represented millions of dollars in today's money. The human cost of these crimes went far beyond simple numbers. Each kidnapping represented the destruction of a family, the theft of a life, and the continuation of a system that treated human beings as property. Many victims were never found, living out their lives in slavery hundreds of miles from their homes. Children were separated from parents, husbands from wives, and entire communities lived in fear of similar attacks. The geographic size of the gang's activities was equally staggering. Evidence collected during the investigation showed connections to criminal networks working from New York to Louisiana. The Cannon Gang had been part of a larger system of illegal human trading that took advantage of the area confusion and limited police capabilities of the early 19th century. Patty Cannon's body was first buried in the graveyard of the Georgetown jail where she died. The burial was done without any ceremony, showing the community's desire to forget the horrors linked to her name. When that land was later developed into a parking lot in the 20th century, her remains were moved to a poor person's graveyard near the new prison. In a strange twist that shows the sensationalist attitude toward her crimes, her skull was separated from the rest of her remains and put on display in various places over the years. As recently as 1961, it was on loan to the Dover Public Library, serving as a creepy reminder of one of Delaware's darkest chapters. This treatment of her remains, while disturbing by modern standards, showed the public's continued interest in her crimes and their desire to remember the horrors she had committed. The legacy of Patty Cannon goes far beyond her individual crimes. Her story shows the planned violence that supported American slavery, the weakness of free black people in the time before the Civil War, and the ways that geographic and legal gaps could be used by advanced criminals. The reverse Underground Railroad she operated was the dark mirror image of the networks that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. A reminder that for every story of freedom, there were countless others of re-enslavement and death. Modern historians continue to study the Cannon case as an example of how criminal businesses could grow in the gaps between legal areas. Her ability to work for almost 20 years, even though local communities knew, demonstrates the combination of racism, legal limits, and money incentives that allowed such horrors to continue. The case also highlighted the limits of early 19th century police work. The lack of coordination between different areas, the absence of professional police forces, and the limited communication abilities of the time all helped the gang's ability to work without punishment. These lessons would later help efforts to develop more effective police strategies for dealing with crime across state lines. The impact on the local community was deep and lasting. The area around Johnson's Crossroads never fully recovered from its connection to the Cannon Gang. The name was eventually changed to Reliance in an effort to escape the shame, but the stain remained for generations. Property values in the area stayed low for decades, and many families chose to move away rather than stay in a place linked to such horrors. The Cannon case also had wider effects for American society's understanding of race and crime. The willingness of authorities to finally prosecute these crimes, even though the victims were mainly black people, marked a small but important shift in legal attitudes. While this change was limited and temporary, it represented a recognition that all people, no matter their race, deserve legal protection. The documentation and investigation of Cannon's crimes also helped the growing abolitionist movement. The planned nature of the kidnapping network and the ease with which free black people could be made slaves gave powerful evidence for abolitionists arguing that the whole system of slavery was naturally corrupt and dangerous. In the decades after Cannon's death, her story became part of regional folklore, though the details were often changed or made more dramatic. Many books, pamphlets, and newspaper articles retold her crimes, though many mixed fact with fiction in ways that made it hard to separate historical truth from legend. The most famous of these was George Alfred Townsend's novel, The Entailed Hat, published in 1884, which used Cannon's story as the basis for a dramatic tale of frontier crime. The site of the original Cannon house remained a source of creepy interest for decades. Visitors would travel to the remote location to see where the crimes had happened, and local residents developed a small business providing tours and selling souvenirs. The original house was finally torn down in 1948, but the site continued to attract curious people well into the modern era. This mystery shows us how easily society can ignore planned violence when the victims are seen as less than fully human. The lack of care that allowed Patty Cannon to work for decades was finally overcome only when her crimes grew to include white victims whose disappearances could not be ignored. The legal system that failed to protect free black people from kidnapping and murder was the same system that finally prosecuted Cannon only when she threatened the interests of white slave traders. The Cannon case is a stark reminder of the human ability for evil and the importance of watchful police and community responsibility. It shows how criminal businesses can grow in environments where society fails to protect its most vulnerable members. Most importantly, it saves the memory of hundreds of victims whose names are largely forgotten, but whose suffering should never be made smaller or ignored. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about the full size of her criminal network? The evidence suggests that Patty Cannon's gang was part of a much larger system of illegal human trading that reached far beyond the Delaware-Maryland border. Many questions remain unanswered about the full extent of their activities and the fate of their victims. Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this dark chapter in American history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories from America's hidden past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries from our nation's forgotten crimes. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another terrifying true story from the shadows of American history.